Rick Harrison's latest crime has been exposed, and this time, there's no denying it under the flashing lights of hundreds of cameras. The man once hailed as the living legend of Las Vegas, the soul behind adult film stars, and the symbol of the American dream, has now collapsed right in the courtroom. No more antiques, no more witty bargains on the small screen. This time, the evidence revealed cannot be distorted, with testimonies of transactions and invisible bloodstains clinging to every item bought and sold as if they were history, when in reality, they were the perfect cover for a chillingly sophisticated criminal network. Is there any magic left in Rick Harrison's story? Can the American dream he once symbolized still be salvaged? If you want to find out the answer, keep watching to understand why an empire he built could collapse so easily. To truly grasp the moment Rick Harrison fell in court, we must step back and review the journey he's been on. A journey that not only reflects success, but also embodies the classic American dream, built on fake values and hidden truths. If you find this story interesting and full of surprises, leave a comment with the number 1. If not, leave a comment with the number 0. Don't forget to hit like, share this video with your friends and those around you. Leave your comment below so we can hear your thoughts. And make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any exciting videos. Now let's dive into the story. Rick was not born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He grew up in Lexington, North Carolina, in a military family. His father, Richard Harrison, was a strict and reserved former Navy officer. Rick's childhood was marked by a diagnosis of epilepsy from an early age. He frequently missed school and was isolated from community activities while other kids played basketball. Rick read books on war, ancient civilizations, and the value of things that others discarded. These activities not only served as a substitute for a stolen childhood, but also formed the foundation for a unique worldview, one where everything has history and history itself is value. In 1981, the Harrison family moved to Las Vegas, a city of fleeting dreams, gambling, and dollar bills flowing as fast as dice rolling on a table. In a land of quick deals and neon lights where the past is easily consumed, Rick and his father began an uphill journey by opening a pawn shop, a place where the past was valued, preserved, and exchanged for the future. The Gold and Silver Pawn Shop officially opened in 1989, from a modest house near downtown Vegas, and they began trading with all kinds of people, from gambling addicts and high rollers to serious collectors. Rick learned to assess objects not with his eyes, but with his instincts and memory. A small scratch could reduce the value of an item by 30%, and a discolored stamp could be a fake worth no more than a piece of scrap paper. He became famous in the porn industry even before becoming a TV star. Word spread about this guy Rick, who could glance at a watch and immediately say where it was from, which era it belonged to, its current market value, and its global trade history. He didn't need Google. He was Google. In 2009, Rick achieved mainstream fame with the reality TV show Pawn Stars on the History Channel. The show quickly became a phenomenon. Each episode was a snapshot of an item, a story, and a negotiation. Rick wasn't just an appraiser, he was a storyteller. He created emotion. Viewers didn't just watch for the value of the items. They watched for how Rick brought them to life. A classic gun was not just a weapon, it was a war relic. A coin from 1804 was a part of America's financial history, and Abraham Lincoln's signature was a message from the past to the present. Pawn Stars wasn't just a show about antiques. It was where history came alive through the eyes of a man who never went to college. Rick once said, "I don't need a degree to know which coin is valuable. I just need to know the story behind it. Rick's image has become iconic, embodying the self-reliant spirit of America. He started from nothing, overcame the illness that isolated him, built a family business, became a celebrity, wrote best-selling books, and appeared on major talk shows. He wasn't a tech billionaire, but he represented millions of hard-working Americans, those who struggle with every dollar built from the ground up and carry the burden of the middle class. And that is why, when news of Rick's conviction in an international smuggling case broke, the shock was not just cultural, but a crisis of faith. A man once hailed as America's unofficial history teacher now had to stand trial and be charged with one of the most inhumane crimes of the 21st century. Did Rick know and still participate, or was he just a victim of blind trust in the legitimate origins of the items he traded? Rick's downfall did not start with the court's verdict, but earlier, when questionable items first appeared. When history ceased to have value and became a facade, like every classic tragedy, the collapse of Rick Harrison is the journey of a hero descending into darkness. Not because he was evil, but because he believed too deeply in what he once taught America, that every artifact has a story, but if that story is distorted, the storyteller might still be innocent. Not two when history is a disguise. In Rick Harrison's world, every old artifact carries a soul, a past, a story, a part of history. But as Rick once said in an episode of Pawn Stars, history can lie, and if you're not careful, it will deceive you. He had no idea those words would later become a bitter omen for his life. Trouble doesn't come all at once. It silently sneaks in, like most downfalls in life, starting with a small Greek stone statue whose seller did not disclose its origin. Then, a hand-drawn old map not found in any public archive. Next, a jade-inlaid pocket watch once thought to have belonged to an Eastern European official after the war. Over time, the items Rick handled grew increasingly odd, seemingly priceless, but somehow not meaning to exist. The problem is, they always came with valid paperwork. For a business like the gold and silver pawn shop, where hundreds of items are appraised and traded daily, encountering artifacts with unclear histories was not unusual. Rick and his team frequently collaborated with experts, using advanced technology and cross-referencing international databases. But like many industries, placing too much trust in the process can create deadly blind spots. An internal investigative report later presented to the court revealed that from 2017 to 2021, more than 142 antique items, each worth over $10,000, were sold through Rick's shop without clear provenance according to museum standards. Among them, 37 items were flagged by Interpol, but the alerts came too late or were out of sync with the shop's internal check system. A technological gap, combined with near-total reliance on vendor documentation, opened a loophole through which illegal goods infiltrated legitimate trade channels. This makes the story even more alarming as these items were not just fakes or stolen goods. According to the federal indictment, some of them were used as alternative currency in transactions within international human trafficking networks. In other words, the statues, maps, and antique watches were not just collectibles. They were exchanged to transport goods or demand ransom in criminal activities. A prominent example is a Byzantine necklace brought to the shop in May 2019. The seller was an Eastern European woman who claimed to be a collector. The necklace was sold for $26,000. Rick personally handled the transaction after reviewing the certification from a private museum in Prague. Subsequent investigations revealed that the necklace was part of a stolen collection tied to a trafficking victim brought into the U.S. The woman, Elena, became a crucial witness in court, recounting how she was treated like a commodity in exchange for artifacts. What was even more concerning was that Rick sometimes felt something was off. In a leaked internal interview, he admitted, "There are moments when I feel some items are not wrong, not counterfeit, but the wrong ones. But the paperwork is valid, the value is high, and we're not the FBI." That choice, trusting the process more than his instincts, led him down a path of regret. Three fateful items, according to the latest leaked records from police involved in the case. In August 2020, a middle-aged Hungarian man appeared at the gold and silver pawn shop. He was polite, well-dressed, and carrying a wooden box with leather lining. Inside was an ancient Bible supposedly printed in the 17th century in Transylvania. The book still had its original leather cover. Inside were handwritten Latin notes and an envelope containing papers verifying the provenance, stamped by a local museum in Romania. The book held immense religious, cultural, and historical value for Eastern Europe. The man spent nearly 40 minutes inspecting the item, cross-referencing the handwriting, examining the paper, checking the cover structure, and verifying the printing details. Everything seemed perfect when the seller quoted a price of $38,000. Rick didn't negotiate. He immediately agreed to record the transaction under his name and place the book in a private, non-display collection, reserved for rare or secretive items that Rick didn't realize on that very day. An undercover officer from the Federal Human Trafficking Task Force, HTTF, had been following the Hungarian man from the airport to the shop. This man had been under surveillance for months for suspected involvement in an international human trafficking ring laundering money through the sale of antiques. 4 days later, Rick received a letter from the FBI requesting information on the transaction. The letter did not specify the reason but emphasized that this was an item under international investigation. Familiar with working with museums and archaeological organizations, Rick didn't feel worried. In fact, he confidently sent the FBI the entire transaction record, including photos of the book and the seller. However, within the FBI, questions began to arise. How did an item identified as an illegally traded artifact related to human trafficking in the Balkans end up in the hands of Rick Harrison, a man known for being extremely cautious in high-value transactions? Did Rick really not know, or was this a calculated move in a bigger scheme? A secret investigation was launched. Agents quietly began to thoroughly review the shop's transaction records, and what they discovered was astounding. The Bible was not the first questionable item. Over the course of 2 years, at least 11 artifacts from Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and the Caucasus entered the shop through dubious transactions, mainly carried out by Rick or one of his 3 closest associates. Investigators believe the Bible was the first domino piece, not because of its value, but because it helped map the journey of the goods, tracing their route from illegal trading points to Rick's shop, then to auction houses or private collectors. A closed-loop trading model began to emerge, where stolen or illegally traded artifacts were legalized through intermediary locations. Rick's pawn shop operated as a gold filter. The situation began to escalate. Rick started receiving subpoenas demanding cooperation to provide records and clarify transaction details. By this point, nothing seemed out of place. Porn stars continued to air, with Rick giving his usual deep insights into revolvers, Wabu-era airplane parts, and other historical items with his trademark expertise. But those closest to him, especially his son Corey Harrison, began to feel something was wrong. In a conversation with an attorney, Corey admitted that he had become overly cautious when rechecking even items we sold last year, not because he was afraid of making a mistake, but because he was afraid he had missed something. Rick began staying up late, researching documents and calling experts he had worked with to verify the information. But it was too late to undo what had been done. In March 2021, the FBI officially announced that the gold and silver pawn shop was under investigation for potential involvement in an international human trafficking and money laundering network. Rick Harrison was not only a witness, but also a key individual demanding a thorough investigation into his level of involvement. The story was no longer just about a few lost artifacts, but about the connection between the porn star brand and one of the most sophisticated criminal networks operating in Europe and the US. The public still didn't know Rick had not been arrested, but he knew one thing for sure. The game had begun, and he was the one truly pulling the strings in the world of antique trading, where a Roman coin could take a life and an 18th century map could conceal a human trafficking ring. The line between legal and criminal was becoming increasingly blurred after a fateful Bible brought Rick Harrison into the crosshairs of federal investigators. An urgent question was raised. Was he an active participant, or just a pawn manipulated in a network he couldn't even control? According to an unofficial source, the FBI had identified a special group of clients from specific countries. These individuals often carried high-value antiques with legitimate documentation and conducted transactions directly with Rick or through an intermediary named Victor Marek. His name first appeared on a bill in 2018 for a watch sale, and since then, he has appeared like a shadow in dozens of high-value transactions worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The suspicious detail was that Victor had never appeared on any of the Pawn Stars episodes. Rick had never publicly mentioned him, and he wasn't an official employee of the shop in the internal system. His name appeared as a VIP reference. Research showed that Victor Marek, a young Czech citizen, was an antique appraiser for a private gallery in Vienna. According to records from European intelligence agencies, he disappeared from the art world around 2015 after a scandal involving a counterfeit painting worth $1.22 million. Since then, no one knew his whereabouts. To this day, high-value antique transactions around the world continue to occur, from Istanbul to London, from Prague to Las Vegas, all bearing the same signature, a small italicized M with 3 horizontal lines beneath it. Sources also state that the FBI suspects Marek is the man in the shadows, a key intermediary creating the perfect cover for the trade of items tied to human exploitation, and Rick may have met Marek early on, perhaps not even knowing his true identity, seeing him only as an informed broker with extensive connections, always bringing great deals. An investigator noted in an internal report, "Rick operates on instinct, but with Marek, everything is securely locked in law on paper, which is why Rick trusted him, and that's why he was led astray." This wasn't the case of a reckless entrepreneur chasing profit, but a story of sophisticated manipulation, exploiting Rick's greatest weakness, his trust in his own instincts and expertise. The most crucial evidence discovered was an email exchange between Rick and Meek under the pseudonym M. Hawk, using the encrypted Proton mail service, where Rick stated, "I don't feel good about this Mesopotamian mask. It looks like the one missing from the museum last year." Marek replied, confirming that the mask is from a private collection in Georgia. Completely legitimate. Don't think too much. This shows that Rick may have suspected but still chose to proceed, perhaps due to Merrick's reassuring words or pressure to maintain his reputation. Ultimately, Rick couldn't continue rejecting certain items that could become the focal point for upcoming TV episodes. Here, the moral dilemma deepens. A baker doesn't necessarily have to know where the wheat comes from, but an antique dealer handling transactions worth hundreds of thousands of dollars is a different story. The academic community began debating. Is Rick a victim or an unofficial accomplice? An art history professor from UCLA commented to The Atlantic, "When you claim to know the origins of every item you sell, you can't escape responsibility when one of those items becomes the key to a crime against humanity." What particularly puzzled investigators was Rick's silence. He might have suspected, he might have been worried, but he never reported anything, and that silence turned him from a potential witness into the prime suspect. Was Rick worried about tarnishing his brand, afraid of being seen as losing his sharpness if he couldn't distinguish between what was authentic, legal, or illegal? Or more deeply, did Rick know something but choose to conceal it? If you find this story interesting and want to learn more, don't forget to like, share the video, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Now, let's continue the story. Amid this cloud of doubt, a surprising clue emerged. A security footage copy from the shop showing Merrick entering with a woman with her face covered, later identified as a victim of a human trafficking ring from Bulgaria. They didn't carry anything. They just spoke to Rick in the private office for 7 minutes. No transaction, no sound on the footage, just ambiguous body language and gestures too vague to interpret, but enough to raise the possibility that Rick might know more than he admitted. If this were true, the public could no longer confidently trust Rick's innocence. Fans who once idolized him would split into factions, those defending him and those condemning him. And Rick, he remained silent. No interviews, no posts on social media, quietly preparing his defense, working with his legal team because he knew this was not just a case, but a battle for his entire life and legacy. And through all the speculation, the central question still hung in the air. Is Rick Harrison a player or a porn star? A victim of deceit? Or someone who knows the truth but chooses silence? The legal battle, the federal court in Las Vegas, had never been so packed with media. From local stations to CNN, from New York Times to June and the networks, everyone was present. The man who once brought laughter and knowledge to millions through television now sat silently in the defendant's chair, wearing a light gray suit. His eyes no longer filled with the wit they once held, the camera no longer focused on him as a celebrity, but as a fallen icon. Federal prosecutor Sandra Rivas didn't waste time arguing her case in the opening statement. She confidently declared, "Defendant Rick Harrison is not just a careless businessman, he is an active link in the chain of legalizing goods related to human trafficking, and this was not accidental, it was deliberate." She presented a summary of 73 suspicious transactions over 5 years, amounting to over $3.8 million, of which at least 16 items were directly related to illegal human trafficking operations across Europe and Latin America. Images of the victims, women and children, were shown one by one on the courtroom screen. Some of them would testify directly, others had disappeared. Rick lowered his head, avoiding the images, and a few people in the courtroom began to cry. Items that once appeared on Pawn Stars, hailed as entertainment highlights, now contrasted with the painful stories of broken lives, blurring the lines between television and crime in a chilling way. Rick's lawyer, Charles Denning, a former senior prosecutor, took a completely different strategy. He didn't deny the existence of the transactions or the dubious origins of some items. Instead, he focused on legal responsibility. Mr. Harrison runs a business with thousands of transactions every year. He is not the police. He has no access to immigration records or the ability to conduct international investigations. He was exploited by smart, organized criminals who knew that Rick, due to his fame and the needs of television, would take risks if the paperwork seemed clean. Rick's legal team presented evidence of his previous cooperation with law enforcement procedures to verify the origin of goods and times he refused suspicious items. They also revealed internal emails showing Rick had once expressed doubt about a stone statue, but was advised by experts that there was no convincing reason to dismiss it. However, for the prosecution, the fact that Rick suspected but still proceeded was at the heart of the issue. He's not stupid. On the contrary, he's smart, and his intelligence is what makes him dangerous because he knows how to legalize wrongful acts without leaving a trace. Sandra Rivas emphasized that the trial had become a battle of image and logic. The prosecution portrayed Rick as cold, calculating, and silent to protect his brand. The defense described him as someone caught in a complex network, overwhelmed by the sophisticated tactics of international crime. Meanwhile, the public, whether watching from behind screens or outside the courtroom, remained divided. Some believed Rick was a victim of the underground world, while others believed he was part of it, whether he admitted it or not. The turning point came when one of the victims, Elela Nena, an Eastern European woman previously mentioned in the trial, took the stand to testify. She recounted that she had been stripped of her freedom, trafficked across borders, and ultimately traded for an antique item. A Byzantine necklace had appeared in an episode of Pawn Stars in 2020. I saw him, Rick Harrison, holding it, admiring it, and joking with the customer about its beauty, but he didn't know that this necklace was the price of my freedom. The courtroom went silent. Rick looked up, meeting the witness's gaze. For the first time in his eyes, there was no challenge, no tears, just a weight. His lawyer objected to the direct link between Rick and the necklace, arguing that he didn't know its origins, but in the public courtroom, the damage was done. The story was no longer about money or antiques. It was about the suffering of people. In the final days of the trial, a surprise witness was called to the stand. Corey Harrison, Rick's son and co-star in Pawn Stars. Under the hopeful gaze of his father, Corey took the stand. Then, in a calm, almost cold voice, he said, "I told my dad that some of these items weren't right, but he told me not to let emotions affect the business. Maybe I should have pushed harder. Maybe I'm partly to blame." That testimony was the final emotional blow. The trial ended in a heavy atmosphere, and Rick made no further statements. The press called it a trial of a generation, a moment when the audience was forced to face the reality that reality TV is not immune to the truth, and the hero they once admired might just be an ordinary person with flaws, contradictions, and sometimes danger. So, the question remains, is Rick Harrison the perpetrator or just a pawn in a meticulously crafted plan that even he couldn't distinguish from truth? 6 people betrayed by family, divided by teammates. If legal evidence is the dagger of the system, then the betrayal from family is the blade aimed at the deepest trust in Rick Harrison. The courtroom was not just the place to face criminal charges, but where every relationship that had once been the emotional pillar of his life began to crack. Corey's testimony, his own son and partner throughout nearly the entire journey of Pawn Stars, cut through the tense atmosphere like a knife. Corey didn't shout. He didn't cry. He spoke in a calm, almost indifferent tone. "I warned my dad about the items from Eastern Europe. They were too perfect, too flawless, and appeared too suddenly. But my dad believed everything was fine, as long as the paperwork was in order." The courtroom went silent. Rick didn't flinch, but he slightly leaned back in his chair, like a man realizing a hidden wound he had buried was now exposed, impossible to hide any longer. To the public, it seemed like Corey was simply speaking the truth, perhaps even trying to save him by drawing a line. "I warned him, but I couldn't control him." But for Rick, his son's testimony was a brutal confirmation that he was no longer protected, not even by those closest to him. Not just Corey, a series of senior employees from Pawn Stars, individuals Rick had once considered family, also began to withdraw their support. Chumley, real name Austin Lee Russell, who had once brought laughter to the show, was absent from the trial and made no public statements. According to media reports, he had quietly left Las Vegas to avoid being involved in a lawsuit that could harm his personal reputation. The atmosphere within the group that built the Pawn Stars brand had become extremely tense. Those who once shared time on screen calling each other brothers now fell silent, hired their own lawyers, and distanced themselves from the empire Rick had built over 30 years. One of the shop's financial managers, when called to testify, admitted, "We suspected. But Rick has a habit of handling big transactions himself. He trusted his instincts more than any system, instincts that were legendary but had now become his Achilles heel." Worse yet, rumors began to spread in the press that one of the suspicious transactions, a sale of an Egyptian goddess statue allegedly linked to a human trafficking ring, had been facilitated through Corey's private connections. Although he wasn't directly named in the contract, independent investigative bloggers began to speculate whether there was a secret deal between father and son. Corey was now trying to pull away to save himself. Corey denied the allegations, issuing a statement through his lawyer saying that he had not been involved in any illegal activities and was fully willing to cooperate with any independent investigation. But for Rick, the damage was irreparable. In a leaked video, recorded as he left the courtroom, Rick turned to his lawyer and asked bitterly, "If my son doesn't trust me, what do I have left?" This was no longer the question of a defendant, but the whispered words of a father, a man who had once stood at the pinnacle of fame, now watching those closest to him walk away one by one, like a dream collapsing in slow motion. But there's an important point to note. None of Rick's family members, not even Corey, directly accused him of committing the crime. Instead, the story revolves around a central argument that he ignored warnings, became overly confident, chose to handle everything his own way, and overlooked the red flags. This painted a picture even more tragic. Rick was not an evil man, but a smart one, destroyed by his unwavering trust in himself, and in doing so, he pulled everyone closest to him out of their safe orbit. Media analysts called this the turning point in the case. If Rick were a schemer, the story would be simpler. But Rick was a father, a mentor, a leader, someone who inspired others. And when those around him began to turn their backs, The most painful question was no longer whether he committed the crime, but when did he lose himself before the audience? His downfall was not just the image of a man on trial, but the collapse of an entire value system, from family relationships to workplace relationships to the community of viewers who once saw Rick as a familiar storyteller. Everything was now being challenged all at once. This internal rift was perhaps even more devastating than the external charges. Empires often fall under external pressure, but in the end, Rick's empire fell from within, at the very place he once thought was the safest. Seven truths were revealed. The so-called truth in a criminal trial is not just a series of objective events, but something built through perspectives, evidence, testimony, and the persuasiveness of whichever side can convince the jury better. For Rick Harrison, in the final days of the trial, the truth he faced was not just what had happened, but which version of the truth the court and the public would choose to believe. As the prosecution continued to present evidence linking Rick to transactions involving goods from notorious human trafficking hotspots, the defense countered with humanitarian arguments. Rick was not a saint, he was a businessman, a TV personality, a father, and he made mistakes not out of malice but because he believed he was doing the right thing. However, the most devastating blow didn't come from the prosecution, but from a leaked internal surveillance report, revealing that at least 3 security camera recordings had been deleted from the shop's storage system within 48 hours of major transactions linked to Victor Merrick. An IT employee who was called to testify stated that he had received orders from senior management but could not confirm whether Rick had directly given the directive. The prosecution immediately seized on this detail, nailing the coffin of doubt. A business records everything, but the most crucial footage went missing. Was it a system failure or a deliberate act? Rick Harrison may not have deleted those tapes, but why didn't he investigate when he discovered the data was missing? There was no clear answer for most of the trial. Rick remained silent. But at one point, standing before the court, he said something that made the entire courtroom pause. "If I'm wrong, I'll pay the price. But if I'm right and still convicted, then perhaps this system needs to reconsider how it defines guilt." His words were not loud, but they hit the heart of the debate. Did Rick commit the crime, or was he trapped in a legal maze where negligence could be considered intent? Rick's legal team proposed a final strategy: to accept partial civil liability in exchange for a reduced criminal sentence. This common tactic in high-profile criminal cases would involve a guilty plea to avoid the risk of decades in prison. According to internal sources, Rick faced up to 25 years in federal prison if convicted of all charges. By pleading to lesser charges, cooperating, and agreeing to compensation, he could face only 3 to 5 years in prison, then attempt to rebuild his reputation. The night before the trial ended, an unexpected figure appeared at Rick's lawyer's office. A woman dressed in black, wearing a hat that obscured half her face, introduced herself as Lude Miller, a former victim of human trafficking now legally residing in the U.S. She brought with her a recording of a conversation between her and Victor Merrick from 2020, in which Merrick clearly stated, "Rick will never know. He thinks he's dealing with a museum. No one suspects the smart ones." Although the recording was not accepted as official evidence due to its illegal origin, it was enough to make Rick realize one thing: he could have truly been manipulated. But did that even matter when the consequences were for him to bear? The next morning, Rick stood before the court, preparing to make his final statement. He had to choose whether to accept the plea deal or face the public verdict with all the risks. After several days of deliberation, Rick chose to reject the plea deal. "I would rather be convicted for trusting the wrong person than live the rest of my life in shame for lying to save myself," he declared, looking directly at the prosecutor. The court fell silent. The jury retired to deliberate, and Rick, in his familiar silver suit, closed his eyes. He was no longer the appraiser of others' assets. Now he was the one being judged by society, and the price to pay could be his freedom or the end of his story. "8 hours. That was the time the jury deliberated after nearly 3 weeks of intense trial. During that time, Rick sat quietly in the waiting room behind the courtroom, holding a briefcase that actually contained a notebook filled with questions he had once written for the porn stars. No lawyer by his side, no cameras, just him, a 58-year-old man who once commanded a television empire, now waiting to see if his life would continue in the outside world or behind bars. Finally, the verdict was announced. "We, the jury, find the defendant Rick Harrison guilty." Just a few words, but they fell like a sword striking the ground. A faint sob echoed from the back rows. Rick didn't collapse. He didn't cry. He just exhaled, as if finally the verdict was no longer the thing he feared most, but the confirmation that everything had truly ended. If you've made it this far and found this story truly captivating, don't forget to hit like, share this video with your friends and those around you so they can discover this secret too. Leave a comment below to let us know your thoughts, and make sure to subscribe to the channel to stay updated on the latest and most exciting videos. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.